let's put all this into focus now and take a closer look at what is really happening to the U.S. economy. And joining us now, Anthony Chan. Anthony is a former chief economist at JPMorgan Chase. Thanks very much for joining us. Always a pleasure to see you.
Good to see you, Sean.
I want to get right into it by talking about the meeting between Jerome Powell and U.S. President Biden. How significant, and this sets the tone for exactly what?
Well, I think that the president has basically made it very clear that he's handing off the responsibility of trying to lower inflation. That, of course, means that the Federal Reserve has free rein, but it also means that if the Federal Reserve doesn't lower inflation quick enough, it's going to be on their side of the court, and the president will be able to assign that responsibility and perhaps even blame to the Federal Reserve if inflation doesn't go down quickly.
Now, Biden clearly taking a different approach than his predecessor did to the Fed, Donald Trump, and a lot is going wrong with the U.S. economy right now. How important is Biden's hands-off approach, or do you see it as a way of saying it's in your court?
Well, I see it as a way of saying it's in your court, but at the same time, the Federal Reserve does have the tools to lower inflation pressures, and for them to be able to use those tools without any interference is a step in the right direction. The problem is that their tools are blunt, and if they use them aggressively, they will cause a recession. And in fact, the odds are significantly high that as we go into 2023, that we can push the economy into recession. It's not a foregone conclusion, but certainly the probability is quite high given the fact that inflation is so high at this juncture.
Yeah, it's interesting you talked about the tools are blunt and could really do some damage. And a lot of people have wondered, should the Fed have delved into this a bit earlier? And when you look at inflation, simply punishing the U.S. economy, many fear there's no end in sight, or as you mentioned, things could get a lot worse.
Well, Sean, the Federal Reserve has in fact admitted that they should have gone a lot sooner. But you have to remember that when the Federal Reserve should have gone in, perhaps late last year, the Federal Reserve leadership was still in limbo. The Fed chair didn't even know if he was going to be reappointed. They didn't really have a mandate from the White House to keep going. So given all that uncertainty, I think the Federal Reserve decided to stay on the sidelines and not move more aggressively. Now, could we say it was a mistake with the benefit of hindsight? We could. But I think it's important to understand why the Federal Reserve didn't move more aggressively. And then, of course, when people say the Federal Reserve didn't estimate inflation correctly, you got to remember that we continue to see non-economic events influencing the inflation pressures. That, of course, meant the path of the pandemic and, of course, the war situation with Russia and Ukraine. All those things caused higher, not lower inflation.
And I want to get to those in just a second, but also Joe Biden has an op-ed out in the Wall Street Journal. I don't know if you've had a chance to see it, so this may be an unfair question. If you have, your thoughts, and if you haven't, how important is it for the president to get his plan out there, to at least say, look, I'm doing something, here's what I want to do?
Well, Sean, yes, I had a chance to read that op-ed several times just to make sure that I really got underneath the intention of the president. And I think the president wants to tell the American people that he is trying to do something. Surveys show that 87% of the American people are stressed because of inflation. And in fact, consumer confidence is at a decade low because of higher inflation. The labor market and the economy are pretty robust, but because of inflation, sentiment is weak. And so the president feels he has to get ahead of this. Right now, inflation is public enemy number one in the United States, but at the same time, it's public enemy number one in other parts of the world, like Europe. They also have inflation. But the president has to tell the American people, or at least give the impression that he's doing something about it.
Yeah, and you talked about the unknowns, and clearly Wall Street does not like to be surprised. We have the Ukraine-Russia conflict going on, as well as the pandemic that continues to rear its ugly head. Considering all this, are we going to see more bruising of the markets?
Well, I think we can until these problems go away. If the conflict sort of eases, that'll be a big plus. If all of a sudden the COVID situation in China improves, that'll be a big plus. And not to mention the fact if we don't get another second round of the pandemic, that'll be another plus. But at the same time, the central bank has to do its job. And the only thing the central bank can do, they can't improve supply chains. They can't force people to come back to work. All they can do is influence demand in order to control prices. And what they're doing is to reduce demand. And if they reduce demand too much, a recession occurs. If they reduce demand too little, inflation continues. So they have to be very, very careful with what they do.
Walking the tightrope. Anthony, always a pleasure. Thanks very much. Anthony Chan, former chief economist at JPMorgan Chase.